the idea was like no amount of explicit learning is needed. And there are certain other kind of language learning proponents that try to push this idea that it should all be implicit, because any of the explicit rules or explicit things, like that's not really learning how to use the language. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think that there's so many different areas where explicit learning improves things, and and the idea that like you can't transform something that you learned more explicitly into a more kind of implicit automatic thing is really at odds with the vast majority of literature on learning across many different topics, that I feel like is important for me, or that I see as kind of a trend across different areas in the research on learning, is that you want to be moving back and forth between different kind of modalities or different kind of contexts, different situations. And so, when it comes, I mean, this is a simple example with language learning, and this is just, you can just do this with comprehensible input as well, where it's like I found something that's helpful is like I listen to a podcast and then I'll read it, or I'll read it and then I'll listen to it and then I'll read it again, like going back and forth like that, because when I'm reading, I have a lot more time to understand. I can look up specific words, right, that maybe I'm unfamiliar with. I can look up, one of the things I do I don't just sit there and read, right? I look up a word, and I also try to figure out, like, I presume you use Pleco, the Chinese, this is a Chinese language dictionary for anyone who doesn't know. And one of the features that I really like is that you can see all of the words, or a lot of the words that share the same character, or related words to a word that you're focused on, or you can see example sentences used in a variety of example sentences. And so it's like, that's the kind of practice that is important when I'm reading. And then when I'm listening, I obviously I can't do that. But at the same time, it's like, I don't get to stop and pause. It's like it's coming at you fast and rapidly. And
I think switching between the modalities as well, a very interesting point about so like another way of doing that would be sometimes watching content, like for example TVs and shows with Chinese subtitles, or or if it's another foreign language, like the language that you're learning, and then sometimes turning the subtitles off just to practice listening as well. I think we touched on like the use of explicit learning in language learning, and how that in the past that's been looked quite badly upon. What would your view be on it now, in terms of, does explicit learning in both vocabulary acquisition and grammar have a role in language learning, would you say, in order to speed up this process?
I think for sure it does. I do think that Stephen Krashen has made an excellent point, or in the 80s, again, so many years ago, that you can, and this is his distinction between language learning and language acquisition, which is, I use the term language learning just to mean like learning languages in general, learning how to use and speak them. But his point was that you can learn, for him, like language learning is when you learn about a language, you learn about the rules, you learn about the vocabulary, learn about the different, subject verb agreement kind of things. But that doesn't mean that you can actually produce them and use language as a way to convey meaning. And so I think you can spend too much time in this grammar world, but I think I think it's kind of complementary. So I really like a grammar textbook. It can be really good. I am not at all against, and the authors, if they're good, they try to build things up over time, and they try to kind of interleave topics. And I have my little nitpicks. I feel like with every language learning textbook that I've ever seen, I'm like, no, I would have done this example before that one, or I would have changed this or that. Of course, it's like, what do I know? I'm just learning the language, but I'm just an opinionated person. But that said, it's I guess I view it as complementary. I don't view it as a kind of either or thing. And one of the things, I think you may have talked about this in one of your videos, where what tends to happen, or what I think happens, is you learn about this grammatical structure, and if you're, say you're in a language learning class, you take a test on this grammatical structure and you pass the test and it's fine. But the problem isn't that learning about that grammatical structure was bad. It's that you never actually tried to use that structure to speak. And you never encountered that structure in the comprehensible input that you are using. And in particular, I think you can go either way, but in particular, I find it nice to, say, read or listen to stuff and then have explanations about what I listened to or read. Because, in terms of grammatical, explanations of the grammatical structure, because that lets me, I'm not starting from this abstract structure. I'm starting from actual living examples of it in use. And then the grammatical structure kind of explanations help me to understand the nature and the extent of those. And a lot of times, what I don't want is just the skeleton. I don't just want here's the structure, here's an example. No, I want a lot of examples. I want examples in different contexts. I want negative examples. This is what you can't do. You can't do this. This sounds dumb. And it can be a little dangerous to play with negative examples, because then you read it and you're like, oh, I'm going to remember this. It's like, oh, you don't want to remember it. You don't want to remember it. But I think in general that helps to give you a sense of what's, what the world is out there. This is something that I think you may have talked about. Languages are systems of conveying meaning. And so what you're trying to do, there's this idea, I don't know if you've heard of this term before, interlanguage, where the idea is that, so it's the idea of as we're learning languages, the language that I have in Chinese is not the language that native speakers have in Chinese, right? It's it's different. It's an incomplete kind of maybe bastardization of it a little bit, and it has blends of probably English, a little bit of influence of English. It has kind of simplified forms. This kind of thing. It has various issues, and you want to make your interlanguage more and more like real Chinese, the real target language that you're learning. And so to kind of help you do that, I feel like you need examples, but you also need explanations for those examples. And this is something that's consistent with the larger learning literature, is that an explanation by itself is kind of meh. It's actually not that, an abstract principle by itself is not that effective. Usually you want to pair that with multiple examples, and sometimes even just seeing multiple examples is more effective than hearing just an explanation and an example. And so you're trying to build more and more complex structures. And so when you're learning those grammar structures, what I don't think of them as oh, this is the way to say X. I think of okay, this is a building block that I am going to add more grammar structures to. And
I think from my kind of journey with Mandarin, I tried to go quite light on grammar, in that I wasn't getting into anything, but there were a few real things that really helped me. That I think for example in Mandarin, A big one is like sentence patterns. There's like an awful lot of really common sentence patterns that you can just learn through. You can learn through loads and loads of examples and a slight bit of explanation, and that will do wonders for like if you were to just rely on comprehensibility, but just hope that you've seen it enough times to the point where you kind of magically understand it, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to take an awful long time. However, knowing a bit about that sentence structure from like a grammar textbook or like there's like a lot of online resources that help try and explain these patterns. Knowing a bit about that, I think, would really, really help and speed things up. And then seeing enough examples, like I think the main point that kind of really resonated with me is seeing the examples. Like I just used to get as many as I could. I'd just collect them, like all these examples, the sentence patterns, and then I try and produce based on like how the way my brain's summarizing, the way that this pattern is used. I'm going to attempt to use my interlanguage, right, to like try and use this pattern, and I'm going to get corrected, and then I'm going to be every time I'm going to be getting a little bit closer to the way that a native speaker would be using it. So definitely, I think that's a really good point. Definitely. So yeah, I think some explicit grammar instruction could it's kind of like you said, it's complementary, isn't it? We're trying to speed things up. We're trying to find it's almost like a shortcut in some ways. However, I do think there are some problems. Like there's all the extremes in language learning. I think some people kind of like maybe go a bit too far with grammar to the point where they're too scared to speak because they're worried they're going to get grammar wrong, or they're going into like I think one of the other things that could potentially be dangerous. Again, this is more of an opinion for me. Is like learning explicitly the way you order a sentence, like without seeing examples, so that you're just in your head you're thinking, right, I need to put me here and then the weather here and then the time here. Like I think that you've got to, because when you're speaking to someone, you don't have time to think about where the weather goes in this sentence. So I think I would more lean towards more on examples and then a bit of explanation of those examples, like personally for me, in order to